Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video I want to give you my take on Amber Amethyst Aggro for Set 6 AZURITE. There always seems to be a lot of hype behind this ink pairing for an aggro deck whenever a new set comes out, only for it to usually fizzle out because it just doesn't end up holding up in the meta. So we're going to talk about some strengths and weaknesses with some of the new additions that this ink pairing and this kind of deck received with AZURITE, and then we'll take a look at just some quick demo matches against what would normally be a tough matchup for this deck to see how you can maybe pilot it in order to make it somewhat relevant in the meta. And again, the meta changes, so how it is now at the beginning of the set might be different from how it will perform, in a month's time once the meta has settled a little bit more. Regardless though, you can see here on the cost curve we're maxing out at 4 cost. We're playing a total of 20 Amber cards and 40 Amethyst cards. Our inkable count is 41 and our uninkable count is 19. We've got a very heavy character spread at 49 characters, only 7 actions and 4 locations. This to me seems like the easiest way to make this deck viable without running into a lot of bricks, without running into a lot of air quotes combo cards that make this deck a little bit harder to function, because if you draw a card that you need a very specific line of play for, that card is going to be dead, and aggro already struggles with card advantage. Not only that, if you're playing things like Daisy Duck and like the Amethyst Chromacon, like what was advertised and used in the last set for set 5 Shimmering Skies, you got to remember that you're giving your opponent more resources to slow you down. So you have to be very mindful of that. Aggro strategy is kind of, all or nothing, right? Either you win very early, or if it gets to the mid or late portions of the game, you likely are going to lose because other decks will come online and just start shutting you down. So with that being said, your 1-drop slots are where the majority of your uninkables are. In fact, all of your 1-drops are uninkable in the Daisy Duck, the Lilo, and the Maleficent, all being played at 4 copies each for a total of 12 characters in the 1-drop slot. Your additional 1-cost cards are going to be 3 Befuddles. This will help you maintain some tempo at the cost of card advantage, obviously, but you don't really care about card advantage because if your 1-drops can survive and quest for 4 lore instead of 2 across 2 turns because you slowed your opponent down with their 1-drop by bouncing it back to hand, or their 2-drop, you get some good value there. One of the newest additions, and a card that's proven to be a pretty good thing for aggro, is the new Lilo. It is a super rare from AZURITE. It's the Escape Artist. It's a 1/2 body that is inkable, costs 2, it also quests for 2, and if it's in your discard pile, it says at the start of your turn, you may play her and she enters play exerted. Now this is not the greatest because she enters play in a form where she can be challenged, and you actually have to make this decision on whether or not you want to bring her back before you even draw your card. Because at the start of your turn, you got to remember the sequence is ready, set, draw, and at the start of your turn, that's before you draw, right? If it's during or before the ready state, you got to well, it can't be before the ready state because you have to pay the ink to play her. So you're going to ready up your ink. If you only have 3 ink, you got to decide at that point, okay, I ready my ink, I got 3 ink. Do I want to spend 2 to play this Lilo from my discard before I even see what I draw for turn? You got to make that decision. Regardless, this card represents constant pressure. If you don't have threats to play, if your hand is depleted, if you're weak and you're like, I just need a little bit of lore to push through to win this game, maybe bringing back this Lilo can put enough pressure on your opponent to say, he plays this for free, he plays what he draws off the top, and I can't deal with both threats. Right? This thing can come back and be constant pressure against your opponent, and it's dealing 1 damage every time your opponent has to deal with it, usually, unless they have something with resist. So in that sense, this card is pretty useful. The Piglet, I often find myself inking this card because it, to me, represents a one-time quest, and for the cost of 2 ink, it just seems kind of expensive for an aggro deck. Because if I was going to protect this or bounce it back with something like a Madam Mim, I'd rather bounce back a 1-drop so that I can play it up for the more efficient cost of 1. Yes, the 1 ink difference matters there. But regardless, it's still a decent card. If it can quest 2 times for a total of 6, it's really, really good. And it is an inkable card that is technically an aggro threat, so I think you still include the Piglet. The Madam Mim Snake represents some significance here for sure because, like I just mentioned, it's a way for you to protect your 1-drop, especially when you're on the play. If you play a Maleficent, a Lilo, or a Daisy, well, usually the Daisy can stay on board, but the Lilo or the Maleficent, once they're exerted, they are very vulnerable and you need to protect them. So bouncing them back with a snake in order to preserve them and replay them later is very, very beneficial. You get an overstated body that's able to bounce back a very weak one drop that's helped you get 2 lore and is now back in your hand to be recast in a ready state in a following turn. The Donald Duck is the only bodyguard I've opted to include here, and this is important because this card serves 2 functions. 1, it protects your board, even though its stats are underwhelming, but 2, it also just helps progress your lore count by giving a character on board 1 lore that, you know, makes a Lilo quest for 3 instead of 2, and same with a Maleficent, for example, on the 1-drop slots. Now, this card doesn't trade favorably into some of the more meta-relevant threats that you might encounter later on, like, you know, a Pete coming down on 3, being a 3/3 body, Madam M Fox on opposing Amethyst builds, etc. But it will serve its purpose if it protects your 1 and 2 drops for an additional turn so that you can quest for another 4 to 5 lore while giving one of your characters +1 in the process. Next up in your 3-drop slot, the Madam M Fox. Yes, while you are an aggro deck, you still need to take care of some anti-aggro threats that your opponent might be playing, and the Madam M does that. Also, being a character that bounces your cards, like I just mentioned with the snake, will help you protect them. So, as usual, ever since this card came out in set 2, I keep saying it, one of the best Amethyst cards in the game, and any Amethyst deck should, I think, right now always be playing this. One of the new additions that we received in AZURITE C is kind of, you know, Merlin Goat at home, air quotes. It's called the White Rose. It's a 3-cost inkable 3/3 body, so just for the stats, it's decent for having an ability. And the ability is when you play this character, you gain 1 lore. Now, this is relevant for a number of reasons. 1, it's something that gets you instant value, gain 1 lore. It puts a body on board that you will likely trade evenly into, because a 3/3 body is going to trade out most things unless your opponent has some top-end threats like Maui or something to take it out and then go 2 for 1 with. So it can help you stabilize a board state, protect your characters because your opponent will take this out and will likely trade into it, and it gets you value on play by gaining you a lore. Worst case scenario, it's also just another inkable card, and aggro threats or aggro decks usually suffer for inkable counts. And we'll take a look at maybe some other aggro examples to kind of flesh this out as we go. I've opted to include 3 copies of this Tinkerbell Fast Flyer. This is basically a carbon copy of Mini Surfer from Ruby, and if you guys remember, if you played during the Rise of the Floodborn metagame, that metagame was defined by Mini Surfer. Now, we're a long ways from that because there are a lot of things that answer a 1/3 body, even though it has evasive. You know, Brawls, the Sisu, Daring Visitor, those kinds of things will instantly take out the Tinkerbell, which isn't great. That being said, though, if you're not up against Ruby or they don't see those answers directly, this thing can be very hard to out, just like Minnie Mouse was. People aren't really teching for evasive threats. But that being said, most meta decks are some variation of Ruby and another color or Steel and another color, and this card is susceptible to all the Steel removal or most of the Steel removal and pretty much all of the Ruby removal. So long term, it might not be something you want to continue to use, but from my very limited testing, it seems to be doing a job. If it gets in there for 2 to 4 lore, or in some matchups, it can basically go unanswered, it can be a game-winning card like that Minnie Mouse was in Rise of the Floodborn's meta. But at worst, again, it can also just be ink, because it is inkable. The next card that I've continued to use in all my aggro builds, and I don't think I usually see a lot of aggro decks with this, is Dolores Madrigal. I think that this card is much better than a lot of other 4-drops that you could be using in this slot. Because first of all, a 3/3 body is pretty good, just like I mentioned with the White Rose, and another reason why I like that card in this deck as well. But the fact that you draw a card, your opponent will likely always have an exerted character on board anyways, is very relevant, and it quests for 2. So this card replaces itself, is a decent statted body on 4, it's inkable, and it quests for 2, right? Like, you can't really ask for more in an aggro deck, in my opinion. You're going to trade out with something, your opponent's going to have to take this off the board because it quests for 2, so you're likely trading evenly into something. It already replaced itself, it got you 2 lore in the process, and it's an inkable card if you see it too early and you can't do anything else with it. In my opinion, it checks all the boxes and should really always be used in an aggro deck. We've only included 3 copies because we have another draw character that's just been introduced in AZURITE C, and this card might be one of the more impactful ones in Genie Wish Fulfilled. This card is basically an upgrade on that Tinkerbell and Mini Surfer that we just reviewed. It's a 2/4 body, so a little bit of extra toughness, a little bit of extra strength for the cost of being uninkable and costing 1 more ink than the Tinkerbell. It has evasive, it quests for 2, but it also has the nice little ability of when you play this character, you draw a card. I think that this is an amazing addition for aggro decks, and it replaces itself on play. It doesn't die to things like Smash. Not really expecting a lot of people to be playing Smash, but it can survive a couple of the Steel songs for sure, and it doesn't get instantly outed by a Sisu Daring Visitor. They need like an Ice Block or something with it for blue-red to take it out. It does still get hit by Brawl, but again, if you've played this on 4 and they spent 3 ink to cast the action Brawl to take this out, you're probably going to be okay with that because, again, this card did replace itself. If it goes unanswered, it's also a 2 quester, which is really nice. And other evasive threats will likely have a hard time taking this out because of the 4 toughness. So likely this thing will survive for at least 2 quests if it doesn't get directly removed with like an action or something like that. And then to round it off, we're playing the goat. You'll notice that we have cut the rabbits because, like I said, between the Genie and the Dolores, I think that these are enough to set up your card draw. You're not really looking to play a grind game by playing rabbit, bouncing rabbit, replaying rabbit. You're just looking to get instant value, and these on the play cards that just get you the card draw right away gets you that value right away. You do want to, however, start bouncing goats if you can. So if you had a choice of what to bounce, the goat is definitely going to be the option because it progresses your game plan and gaining lore very quickly, right? Dropping the goat, questing with the goat, bouncing it back to hand, gaining the lore. That is a very powerful interaction because it just represents another cycle of playing the goat, right? If you're able to play it, quest with it, bounce it, that's 3 lore. You have it back in your hand as a resource. You can replay it, gain the extra lore, quest with it again, most likely. It represents 5 lore over 2 turns, right? So the goat continues to be exactly what it is, the goat, in terms of lore gain. We've already discussed Befuddle. The gathering knowledge and wisdom here at 4. Because you're a deck that can afford to play some decent card draw, I don't think that this card is that bad in these decks. It's a great closer. It's a great way to progress your lore state to just say, I just need a little bit extra to get over the line. This can help you do that or set you up to do that with your other characters. And it's not really negative card advantage once you've progressed your game state enough to the fact that you can kind of close with a card like this, right? You can get over the 20 lore. You just need an extra quest with one of your remaining 2 or 3 characters on board after you cast this. So even though your opponent might answer some of your character threats, between this and your characters, you're going to be able to close out the game. That's kind of how you want to use this. You don't really want to use this early game. You want to mulligan this away, draw it a little bit later on, because you need to develop board state and pressure, and then use this card to close the game off with. And then the location that I've opted to use here is the library, gift for Belle. The extra 1 toughness is nice. You only cost 1 to move there, and it gets you a lore every turn. But what's more relevant is you can put all of your aggro threats on here, and that way, if your Maleficents and your Lilos are stuck in an exerted state where they're not protected, if they're at least at the library, they will replace themselves. And this again is going back to the fact that Amethyst is very good in terms of card management and resource management, and a card like the library fits extremely well with an aggro deck, in my opinion, better than the Queen's Castle, because once you have an aggro threat on the library, you don't care if it gets taken out because you're going to draw into more low-cost aggro threats to replace it, right? And you just care about keeping stuff readied up and questing with it. Your opponent has to answer the library, otherwise it nets you too much card advantage, and if they're answering the library, they're likely not answering your aggro threats, which means your board stays intact and you continue to quest. So that is my build. Maybe if this video is getting too long, I'll put the gameplay up in a separate video.